All right, so we are live. Want to thank everyone for coming up to this special Sunday Night Sinners and Saints, which isn't on a Sunday. We have Alex and Jason with us, who I keep calling James, and even named James in one of the hangouts, so that's a lot of fun right there. For the most part, guys, it's just going to us be hanging out, just sitting back and relaxing. So I think we're going to start off with Jason, who wanted to just kind of start a conversation. Again, it's just a back and forth, so I don't plan on doing a lot. So, Jason, you want to start us off?
Sure. The topic that Alex and I agreed to talk about tonight is what's more rational, Christianity versus atheism. And from my understanding, this isn't supposed to be a knockdown, drag-down debate, so I'm sure we'll both try and respect that. But basically, when you're dealing with the conflict of worldviews, you have to understand that not all conflicts and claims of truth can be resolved in the same fashion. So, for instance, in the case of atheism and Christianity, I am a dogmatic Christian. What that means is that I have a first principle that I start with, and then all other truths follow from that first principle. In the same way, Alex may or may not take that approach. But what we need to do, though, is just evaluate the worldview and the presuppositions and the implications of that worldview and test them for consistency. And that's basically the approach I'm going to be taking tonight.
Okay. You make some assumptions about what you think I'll be doing there, but if you want to do that, that's absolutely fine. But go ahead. I think you should lay your case out.
Okay. Well, as a Christian, we start out with the first principle of revelation of God through Scripture. And from that first principle, we can deduce that there are certain truths that follow from our worldview, such as the fact that truth is propositional. When you look at the way things are in the Bible explicitly assumes the law of non-contradiction. It also assumes the fact that that truth is propositional. It assumes that there are moral values and that there is purpose in life. So basically, from the action of revelation, those certain truths follow. Basically, whenever we become a Christian, Scripture becomes our authority, and that's what we interpret everything through.
Okay, so you say that. Look, I'm just going to grab some paper so I can make some notes as we go along. So you start with the foundation. You say that your God exists, yeah?
That would be implied through Scripture, yes.
Okay, and what do you base that presupposition upon?
It's a first principle. It's where I start.
Okay, and how do you reach that first principle?
By the gift of faith through God that God gives us.
So it's not evidence-based.
Well, yours isn't either.
Well, no. Well, my worldview is entirely evidence-based. You don't know what.
Are you sure about that? Will you want to test that?
I'm absolutely certain that my worldview is evidence-based.
Okay, so where do you start with your first principle? Do you have a first principle?
I start with what I can directly experience.
Okay, so you go through experience. Okay, so is that your first principle? Is experience?
No, I'm not going to go into whether I have first principles or not, because I don't see that that's relevant to whether my worldview is rational or not.
Well, I think it is relevant, because without that principle, your worldview can't even get started, right? So you have
my worldview is perfectly happy because I base it on what I can experience.
Okay, so you're basically taking an empirical approach then, right?
No, you can call it whatever you like. I just go by what I can experience.
Okay, but an experience is subjective, correct?
Oh yeah, everything's subjective. I mean, there's no way around that. Your experience is subjective as well, which is why you can't make any claims of certainty from your religious point of view.
Why not?
Because everything that happens to you you have to filter it subjectively. Do you understand that?
Well, but if that's the case for you, though, doesn't that reduce your worldview to skepticism?
Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but it doesn't actually have any real-world consequences for me. It doesn't prevent me from working in the world I find myself in.
See,
the question I'd ask you of your worldview, much as I hate that word, is what real-world practicalities does it have that mine is denied?
Okay, so you're asking what usefulness that the Christian worldview has that the atheist worldview does not, is that right?
No, I said what real-world practicalities does your worldview have that mine is denied? So in what way is yours more practical for day-to-day living than mine?
Well, practicality isn't necessarily a precursor for truth, though, so I'm not so sure about that question.
But then if, are you saying that you're unable to answer that question?
Well, I mean, I just whenever you see, I don't hold the position that practicality determines whether or not you should accept something. There are
So you're
some
saying
things that
that
are not
your
true that
so
are practical to accept.
so you're saying that your worldview doesn't have to be practical, uh, and yet it's more rational than mine that is practical.
Well, I wouldn't say. I want to qualify. I don't believe that practicality really determines the truth of a worldview. But if you want to talk about the philosophical problems that we're faced with, such as the problem
No,
of skepticism, I believe that my worldview does solve those.
not interested in discussing that at all. The what I'm wanting to look at here is which is more rational and almost wording it in a different way, which is more useful, which is more likely to lead survival. And my worldview, of which atheism is a very small part, and atheism doesn't inform my worldview, is based on what I can directly experience and what I have learned through my lifetime and via the accumulated knowledge of mankind, which has been passed down to me through adults and parents and teachers as I was growing up, and then through my own readings and viewings since I've been self-determining and autonomous as an adult. The thing is that the idea of Christianity being rational, again, it comes down to what real world practicality does your belief have that mine is denied. So, I mean, what can you do that I can't do?
Well, I can solve the problem of philosophy using the first principle of the axiom of revelation.
And is solving the problems of philosophy using the first axiom of the principle of revelation relevant to real world, to going to the shops, to paying your gas bill, to correctly getting to the correct class at school, or being on time for your job? Or is it actually just mental chewing gum?
I wouldn't say that, but certainly atheism cannot declare exclusivity for that either.
Well, I'm not saying that atheism does, because atheism is just a single position on a single topic. It's just whether you believe a God exists or not.
So then, are you referring to empiricism when you talk about practicality?
No, I'm talking about practicality, about what benefit, how does it benefit you, and how is that benefit accorded to you in a way that is denied to me via your worldview?
See, I think that maybe I'm not understanding your question.
It's a fairly simple question. I mean, I can restate it if you want.
Yeah, if you don't mind just rewording it, because there's a couple of different interpretations that I could get from it.
What practical benefit do you have to your beliefs that is denied to me in a real-world situation?
Oh, well, like I said, I think I answered that then, is that I can, using the first principle of the axiom of revelation, I can resolve the philosophical problems that you're unable to resolve.
No, you don't seem to understand, because that isn't a real-world situation. That's just mental chewing gum. In just real-world living day to day, just going about our normal lives. And what I'm going to reduce this down to the way that the vast majority of people think, because the vast majority of people aren't remotely interested in philosophy. And a lot of people feel that philosophy is actually useless. I have an opinion neither way with it. No, but you can wow all you like, Jason, but that is the truth. Most people.
That's a philosophical position, though, that philosophy is useless.
Make sure not to interrupt each other, guys, please.
Jason, the most people out in the street aren't interested. They're not going to have a position on philosophy. If you start talking to them about philosophy, their eyes will glaze over because it has no real-world application for them. I mean, they may apply various things about. Well, I don't even know. I mean, most people, if you ask them, how do you know what you know, then they're never going to have thought about it before. So it has no real-world application. So again, I'll ask, what practical benefit does your worldview have that mine is denied?
I believe I've already answered that question, Alex.
But you haven't. You've brought up philosophy. Now that isn't a practical, real-world application.
Well, you didn't accept my answer, but that does not mean that I did not answer your question.
You've answered a different question. You've answered a question that isn't asked. But I mean, if you want to move on, that's fine. But it does stand that you haven't been able to answer that question.
Okay, let me ask you, I guess, a couple of questions about your worldview. And actually, let me also make a criticism, because I don't view your approach to knowledge as practical at all. Because you're appealing to experience, and I assume by appealing to experience, you're appealing to your sense perception. Is that correct? I'm
appealing to a combination of various things, amongst them being sense. I mean, when you say sense perception, which sense do you mean?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
So when you say that I'm appealing to sense perception, which sense do you mean?
I just mean like your sight, your hearing, feeling things.
Those independent yet mutually corroborative senses that
Right,
give me
your
different
senses. That's
information.
exactly what I'm referring to.
The ones that give me different information, each of them.
Correct.
So what's wrong with using multiple lines of exploration to gain knowledge?
Well, the problem is that all even though you're saying that they're all independent of each other, they all share a common variable in the sense that your brain has to interpret the raw data of sensation and before you're even conscious of it. Whenever you appeal to, so basically what I'm saying is that trying to base your knowledge off of sense perception is actually untestable because you cannot test the accuracy of your brain's interpretation of that raw data in order to make a knowledgeable inference.
And Jason, how do you experience your revelation?
How do I experience it?
Yes.
Well, my revelation is the actual revelation through Scripture. Are you trying to ask me perhaps if I start with my senses before getting to the Bible?
Do you read your Bible with your eyes and process it with your brain?
Absolutely.
So you're in exactly the same situation as I am, so the point is moot.
No, I would say not, because my axiom revelation can resolve the philosophical problems that your empiricism cannot. Empiricism cannot lead to knowledge, it can only lead to sense perception, and no further than that.
No, you can claim that you know what you know if you go through various naturalistic states. I mean, I've explained this before in Hangouts. I can do it again if you want. But it's fairly straightforward. I mean, would you like me to explain it again?
Is it going to be something you've already said in this hangout? Because if so,
I've not said it in this hangout, no.
Then I think you should go ahead and say it.
Okay, well, I'm going to use exactly the same examples I've used before because it's something that's immediately at hand. I'm holding a wooden owl that you can see right here. Now, my individual senses are telling me information about this. My fingertips are telling me which edges are sharp and which are smooth. My muscles are telling me how much it weighs, or that it has a weight. I can feel its kind of density. I can hear it if I bash it. If I sniff it, I can smell that it smells of wood and lacquer, I would guess. If I decided to lick it, I would no doubt get a taste of it, which would probably be the dust upon it. Then when I look at it, photons are bouncing off this object that are coming from the lights in this room. And some of those photons are entering through my eye, going down my optic nerve into my brain. Now, if all the different things I've described there are correct, then I can know what I'm holding. Now, we can test all the individual stages of that, and we know how eyes work, we know what muscles do, we know about nerve endings and things like that. So if everything I've described there is correct, then I know that I'm holding this. And that is how I gain knowledge of things. That's how I gain knowledge of everything else. And that is also the way you gain knowledge of things.
I appreciate you explaining that because I figured it was best that you get that out so that the audience will know exactly what we're talking about. So based off of that, Alex, do you view begging the question as fallacious?
And well, restate that. In what way is this begging the question? Because as I said before we started this, when I was talking to you on YouTube, I think it's important because these conversations get very much bogged down in philosophical terms. And I don't want to be in a position where people are having to look things up. So explain to me what you mean by begging the question first.
Basically, circular reasoning.
So you're saying that by me holding this, I am assuming that I'm holding this before I even start exploring it.
The problem's a little more deep than that, Alex.
Explain it to me, please.
Yeah, because as I explained before, and I won't explain this again because I don't think you've answered it yet, but we'll just see. Basically, what I'm saying is that even though you're trying to appeal to independent senses, you have to understand sense perception, as David Hume and Immanuel Kant recognized, which are two skeptical philosophers from back in the day, is raw data. But you see, though, data has to be interpreted into an intelligible fashion. So what you're looking at whenever you're looking at into the world is you're looking at what your sense perception is giving you. So for instance, let's say you have a world external of yourself that is different from what your sense perception is giving you. Would you see what your sense perception is giving you, or would you see that external world if they were to disagree?
If the senses aren't matching each other, and we see this when we experience car sickness or travel sickness, If the senses don't match, then we start to experience nausea, because the way our brain works is that it expects things to match, and if they don't match, it will say to it, that there'll be some kind of subconscious process that will make the decision that something is wrong. So if you're in a car, you have the sensation of being still, but you have the physical experience of moving. So your eyes are telling you you're moving, but your physical body is telling you that you're still. So some people get motion sickness from this, and you get motion sickness and various other sicknesses in situations like that because your brain will assume you've been poisoned, because the senses aren't giving you correct information or matching information, and they'll cause you to be sick. Now, the reason that I can be confident enough that my ability to integrate these different pieces of sense information is correct is due to evolutionary necessity. If I didn't have that correct modelling based on my sense information, then we as a species wouldn't have survived. We needed to develop that as an evolutionary necessity. Basically, the people who didn't have it didn't survive to pass on their genes. So I've got, if I can prove that, if I can say that each step of my process of experiencing this object is true, if parts of that tale are true, and I can explain that evolutionary necessity is what has led to me having rational thoughts, then I can say that I know what I know. So how are you in a different situation?
Okay, well, before I move on to that, let me just say, you appeal to your sense perception whenever you were trying to explain your epistemology.
Jason,
So
I hate to interrupt.
Please don't interrupt me. I think we agree we wouldn't try to interrupt each other.
The question.
Well, let him finish, and then finish
Okay.
with answering the question that he asked, though, which is, how are you in a different situation?
Okay, let me write that down in case I forget it. Okay, so like I said, Alex, you're appealing to your senses, and if you were using this as a first principle, I wouldn't have as much of a problem with it. But since you're using this as a theorem to explain how you get knowledge, like I said, you're not really, whenever you're describing how your senses work, but that doesn't really give us any idea of how you would be able to justify that your senses are trustworthy. If I were to say that God exists just because he exists, I would assume you would have a problem with that. In the same way, whenever you try and beg the question, whenever you're using a theorem to explain your theory of knowledge, that is something I find to be problematic. But I'll move on and answer your question, though. Your question is how is my situation different in regards to sense perception?
Mm-hmm.
My situation is that I don't believe that I am the product of random mutations guided by natural selection. I am intelligently designed. You know, if God exists and Scripture is true, then I'm able to justify saying my senses of reasoning are valid, because if it were not the case that my senses of reasoning are valid, then there would be no reason for God to give us written revelation in the first place.
So your reasoning's entirely circular?
No, it's not circular. I have a first principle. It's an axiom.
But your first principle doesn't have any evidence to support it.
Well, you seem to be using a theorem in the same way that I'm using my axiom. You're just categorizing it incorrectly.
No, I've said that my senses give me independent information, and that if they don't give me correct information, I soon realise it because I will experience nausea, which is what happens to everybody else. I've also explained to you through evolutionary necessity, I can be confident that my perceptions and modelling of the reality I experience are correct enough for me to be able to function within the reality I find myself. Now, I've asked you how you're any different, and you said that you're different because you believe yourself to be created rather than evolved, and then said various things about revelation. But that, again, doesn't really answer the question. You use your senses in exactly the same way. Now, you assume from your position that I am also created. So, working from that position, again, how is your situation any different? You are, again, using your senses and reasoning to experience the world and then make decisions about this revelation you claim to have had. How is that any different from me experiencing the world? All you're doing is adding a supernatural entity at the start, which I don't have to.
Whereas you're begging the question whenever you answer by appealing to your sense perception to justify your sense perception.
But I'm not appealing to my sense perception to justify
You
my
certainly
sense
are,
perception.
Alex. As I've said,
Okay.
all the senses that you have are interpreted through the same venue. If your brain is not organizing your sense perception incorrectly, then what you're seeing, you're going to see your sense perception and not the external reality outside of you. This is a problem that both Immanuel Kant and David Hume, the skeptical philosophers, dealt with at length.
Again, I'm not interested in what previous philosophers have had to say, Jason. I've explained to you that if my senses aren't giving me information that matches, then I will experience nausea as a physical reaction to that, which is exactly what will happen if you have a mismatched sense perception as well, and everybody watching, because we are all human beings. You're accusing me of begging the question, but I'll ask you, if that's the case, you're saying I'm using my sense perception to justify my senses. Which sense do you use to experience thought, Jason?
Which sense do I use to experience thought?
Yes.
Well, can you qualify for me what you consider a thought to be so I can answer your question better?
That internal dialogue that you have, which is thought, which is what everybody experiences as thought. Do you see it? Do you hear it? Do you smell it? Do you taste it? Do you feel it in your hands? Which sense do you use?
Well, really for thought, you don't really use any of the senses, but I think that the concept of thoughts is actually renders naturalism false.
So you don't use any thought, you don't use any senses to experience thought?
No, I don't.
Okay, so if I'm using my thought processes to integrate the various concepts I experience via my senses, I'm not using my senses to validate my senses, am I?
Well, you appeal to nausea, which would be something you'd be sensing.
No, but I don't only experience things when I'm being nauseous, Jason.
But if you're assuming your reasonings, I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
You've just said that you don't use any senses to experience thought.
That's right.
And I've pointed out to you that if I'm using my thoughts to judge what is valid from the sense information I'm receiving, and using my thoughts to then model the reality around me, then by your own words, I'm not using my sense information to justify my sense information, am I?
Okay, so now you're adding reasoning in there, because at first you were just appealing.
It's a yes or no question. Am I using my senses to justify my senses by your own words, Jason?
Well,
yes
if you're adding reasoning into it, then no, but that's just another assumption,
okay.
however.
No, okay, that's fine. So you agree that I'm not using my reasoning to justify my reasoning?
Well, now that you change your explanation, I don't agree with that.
Reasoning, senses, okay, I'll go back to what you were saying, using my sense information to justify my senses. So you agree I'm not using my senses to justify my senses?
Now that you added in reasoning, then I wouldn't say that. You're just adding a different assumption to justify.
As you hear, I've gone back to wording it in the way that you find acceptable. Am I using my senses to justify my senses? Yes or no?
In the context where you add reasoning in? No, you would not.
I'm not adding in reasoning at this point.
That's also the third time he's answered your question, Alex. You said no every time you've asked.
Okay. But he keeps on then trying to bring this back to whether reasoning's involved. Now, reasoning is part of the thought process. Does it alter when reasoning's involved, Jason?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Is reasoning separate from the thought process?
Is reasoning separate from the thought process? I would say no. Unless if you're in a naturalistic worldview, I guess you'd have to couple them together because it would be nothing more than the product of chemical reactions.
Well, I mean, thoughts are often using electrical signals as well within the brain. But you agree that reasoning is part of the thought process. So I could then say that I'm not using my reasoning to justify my senses. If I'm not using my senses to justify my senses, and I'm not using my reasoning to justify my reasoning, I'm using my reasoning to justify my sense data, and you've agreed that those two things are separate, so that's great. Thank you.
Well, let me go ahead and say a couple of things. I think you've been able to talk a lot more than me so far. I have a couple of issues with your approach, Alex. First off, you started off with just appealing to sense perception alone. Once I pressed you on it, you added reasoning into the equation. However, your reasoning, according to naturalism, is nothing more than the product of chemical reactions. So based off of that point, I don't see how in an atheist worldview, if the reasoning is just a product of chemical reactions, how any chemical reaction can be valid or invalid. So it seems to me that if you're going by the very assumption of your worldview, you have absolutely no foundation to say whether anything's rational or not rational in the first place.
I could say whether things work on a pragmatic level.
You couldn't even judge that from a chemical reaction. There's no such thing as a pragmatic chemical reaction and an unpragmatic one. That's just a concept.
It's not just a chemical reaction. It's ridiculously reductionist to claim that it is, Jason.
So you're not a reductionist empiricist then?
No.
Are you an emergence empiricist then? Do you believe in emergence?
Right. Again, these are phrases that I'm not familiar with, so you're going to need to explain them in a more layman's terms for me.
Okay. Well, I guess by emergence, what I mean is that you sort of you're sort of layering your concepts. Does that make sense?
In what way am I layering concepts?
Well, I said, that reasoning was a part of is just nothing more than a chemical reaction in your worldview. So therefore, you can't judge whether or not it's rational or not by the very implication of your worldview. So then you try to say there was more to it than that. So I was assuming that you were going to layer something on top of that in order to justify it, and that would be more of an emergent naturalistic view.
Did I say that there was more to it?
I think you did try and insinuate that there was. Am I incorrect in that?
No, it's certainly, I don't believe that it is just chemical reactions. I think that you're misunderstanding biology to say that. Also, if it is and it is causing those effects, then what relevance again does this have?
Because you can't get rationality from physical things.
But then, if you're in the same situation, you can't get rationality from physical things either. If you can't get rationality from physical things, I don't
suppose that only the physical world exists. I'm not a physicalist.
What do you think my worldview is, Jason?
I would say you are definitely a physicalist, as far as metaphysics is concerned.
Physicalist?
Mm-hmm. That means you only believe that the physical world exists.
Do you believe in the supernatural realm?
Certainly. It follows from Christianity. It would follow from the first principle of the axiom of revelation, would it not?
Okay. Right. Again, so you're coming back to your revelation, and you're saying that your first starting point is this God you believe in.
Right, and apparently you don't have one.
Can you prove to me that your particular version of your particular God exists before we then get on to what this God is supposedly able to do?
Well, a dogmatic philosopher doesn't try and prove revelation to someone else. It wouldn't be able to be proven to you unless you actually experienced it. Especially in the way that you're approaching your epistemology. You cannot arrive at you couldn't arrive at something so abstract from just reasoning and sense perception alone.
So you have no way of proving your position. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I could give arguments for general revelation, such as the Kalam cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the evidence surrounding the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but I didn't come here to do that tonight.
And also, I would add that you can't do that because you can only do that once you've proved to me that your God exists in the first place. You can't use things that you supposedly believe that being is capable of doing as evidence for that being's existence. The way it would have to work, Jason, you see, is that if you're going to prove that your God exists, your particular version of your God exists, you first have to prove that gods can exist. You then have to prove to me that they do exist. You then have to prove to me that your particular God exists and that he's also the right God. You've then got to prove to me that he has the traits that you ascribe to him. You then have to prove to me that he can inspire people to write the Bible. Then prove to me that he has inspired people to write the Bible. Now, before you can do any of those things, you have to start at the very beginning and explain to me how you prove that this being exists. You can't use things that you believe this being has done as evidence for its existence.
Well, I don't have to. Well, really, I'm not coming here to prove anything tonight. All I'm here to do is just defend Christianity as an irrational worldview. I mean, you've already said that your experience is subjective, so your opinion really, when it comes to objective reality, doesn't really matter, even according to your own worldview, Alex.
Do you believe in objective reality?
I do believe in objective reality because the axiom of revelation, it does follow from that.
And how do you experience objective reality?
How do I experience objective reality?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the same way you do.
Well, I don't. I experience a subjective reality, which is subjective to myself.
So you're denying that there's an objective reality?
How do you experience an objective reality?
Before I answer that, are you telling me that you don't believe there is an objective reality?
I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying that my experience of it can only be subjective. So you tell me, how do you objectively experience this reality? How do you know that this reality that you're experiencing is objectively real?
Well, I experience it the exact same way you do.
Okay, so you borrow from my worldview to experience it.
Well, reasoning and sense perception is not exclusive to the atheist worldview, nor is it exclusive to empiricism.
To be fair, guys, just so you know, we're wandering a little off of why both of you agreed to come on, which I'm fine with. I just want to bring it back to let you know we are wandering a little bit.
Well, I'm fine with the direction the conversation's going. Are you, Alex?
Oh.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm fine with it too. I just wanted to.
Okay, that's cool. I appreciate you saying that, though. Where were we,
So,
Alex? I can't remember.
so with you claim that there's objectivity. I mean, how would you describe objectivity?
How would I describe objectivity?
Hmm.
Whatever conforms to God, because God is by what all things are weighed.
Okay. And are all things of the will of your God?
Yes, everything that does occur, God has decreed.
Okay. And do you, how can I word this? Do you believe your God to be a personal entity? That it's an entity with individual, which is it's a self-conscious entity. Do you believe it to be such?
That would fall from the axiom of revelation, yes.
Okay. So is it possible for anything to be objective if it comes from a single mind?
If it comes from the ultimate mind, yes.
So is your God the source of objectivity, in which case it's subjective, or is he subject to objectivity? So are things objective to him as well, or is objectivity, as you call it, dependent upon him?
Well, if he was a finite God, then I suppose that your question would be problematic, but because God is omniscient in his nature, then metaphysically anything about God, even God himself, is an objective reality. All things exist by and through him, that's what the Bible says.
So that then comes back to my initial point. Prove that this being exists.
So you're asking me to prove that he exists?
Yes.
That's not my responsibility in this discussion. I can't prove to you that God exists if you're going to start with empiricism whenever you're trying to inquire about information, because God is outside of sense perception.
How can you claim that your worldview is rational if you cannot prove that the foundation stone for it exists?
That's a great question. I start with like I said before, I start with the axiom of revelation, and I can test those presuppositions that follow from the axiom of revelation for logical consistency, which would thereby make my worldview rational. Whereas you have no starting point, so I'm actually being generous by letting you talk to me about this, because without a first principle, you can't even get off the ground anyway.
Well, I've given you I've explained to you how I experience reality around me.
You haven't given me your first principle, though. You just denied that you had one earlier in the.
I don't have to give you a first principle for my.
Well, why not? Because we're also
rational.
The rationality of atheism is part of the topic, so I do think you're obligated to share that with me. Where do you start with?
I believe again, atheism is a single belief on a single topic. So explain to me.
You can call it whatever you like. I'm just asking where you start.
Don't interrupt each other, guys.
Well, explain to me, Jason, how my single thought on a single topic has any bearing on the rationality of the rest of my life.
Because if you have a thought that's inconsistent with your worldview, then it would be irrational, such as the concept of the laws of logic and concepts of proof which cannot comport with a naturalistic worldview in the first place.
Okay. That didn't actually make a whole lot of sense, that response. But
do you mind if I explain it a little bit more for you?
Yeah, I would like you to.
Naturalism is the belief that, or you could even call it physicalism, that only the physical world exists. Do you accept that as a proposition in your worldview?
I would accept that by physical world, do you mean everything that we can experience right down to the particle, quantum, and string level?
By the physical world, I just mean basically things that take up space, like material things.
Does light take up space?
Well, I suppose it would. But you're actually, I'm sorry, you're trying to answer my questions with questions. I've been letting you get away with that for the first 30 minutes. I can't let you do that anymore. I just want you to answer the question.
Finding your tone quite aggressive, Jason. I'm just trying to have a civil conversation with you here. You are asking me if I am a naturalist or a materialist. I'm asking you to specify what you mean by that, and then you seem to be getting a little bit agitated when I'm trying to explain to you, when I'm trying to ask you what you mean, when I'm trying to ask you to clarify. Now, do you mean the subatomic? Does that come under the material reality?
Let me just put it to you this way. Do you believe that only the natural world exists?
I believe that that which is real exists.
Okay, so that would essentially just be begging the question. Is that your first principle?
Explain to me how that would be begging the question.
Because you're going to just assume that your own reality is what's real, your own subjective reality.
No, I'm going to assume that the subjective reality that I experience is the reality that I experience. Whether it is the reality is irrelevant because it is the only one I have access to.
Okay.
So I accept that what exists is what exists. Now, if you can prove to me that your God exists, I will accept him. So I have asked you to, and you've not been able to so far.
Okay, well, like I said, I'm not here to try and prove that God exists to you tonight. I'm just here to have a discussion about the rationality of each corresponding worldview. And so far, like I said, okay, let me just ask you this way, because you don't seem to want to answer my question, so I want to ask it differently. How do you account for rationality or irrationality in a worldview where thoughts are only entertained basically by chemical reactions and other physical processes? Where do you get rationality out of that?
I base it upon the models that I construct in my cognitive apparatus and compare that against the reality I directly experience through my senses. I also apply logic, which is descriptive of the reality I find myself in, and see if it matches with that. That is how I do it.
I think you just said something interesting. So you think that logic is descriptive?
Logic is descriptive.
Do you want to retract that before I jump on that?
No, because
Okay.
it is descriptive.
Because if logic is merely descriptive, then everything suddenly becomes unintelligible. Because if you don't think that if the laws of logic are descriptive, then there is no duty to follow those laws of logic in the first place. They're not binding. So if someone wants to object the law of non-contradiction, if laws of logic are descriptive according to your worldview, there's no way you could have any problem with that unless you abandon that assertion.
The only way that the law of non-contradiction would become invalid would be if the reality it describes changed to make it invalid.
Okay, so you're saying that basically, can you just say that again? I want to make sure I heard you right because I don't want to strawman you or anything.
Firstly, I noticed that you're doing quite a lot of restating what I'm saying to try and then make it fit what you want me to have said. But what I'm saying is that something like the law of non-contradiction or any logical law, the only way those laws would change would be if the reality they are describing changed to make them no longer valid.
Well, then that would be impossible because of three things. You have to remember, Alex, the laws of logic are three laws. The law of the excluded middle, the law of identity, and the law of non-contradiction. To say that if reality changed, it would contradict those laws would be affirming the law of non-contradiction. Also, to affirm that reality would be what it is, you would be affirming the law of identity, and you'd also be affirming the law of the excluded middle because it would neither be reality or not reality. So really, even by saying that, you're affirming the laws of logic in the first place and that they are prescriptive, which is something your worldview cannot account for.
They're not prescriptive, they are descriptive. They describe the reality we are in.
Then I have no reason to follow those.
They do not create the reality. Well, if you don't want to follow them, that's up to you, but that means that you have no logical or coherent way of operating within the reality we're in.
Well, that's a straw man. That's not what I said. I'm saying that if you really think that the laws of logic are descriptive, then according to your worldview, no one has any justification to follow them, and all of a sudden your worldview has reduced to skepticism. That's my point. No, because now there's no law of logic that we ought to follow.
Jason, it's not about following them. They describe reality. That's all they do.
So do you follow the laws of logic or not?
Asking if I follow the laws of logic is a completely nonsensical question. They describe the reality I'm in. In what way do you follow the laws of logic? Do you go down and cheer them on from the touchline on Saturdays?
Well, the laws of logic are rules for thinking.
No, they are descriptions of reality that enable us also to model potential realities.
Do you have any sources for that definition?
That they're descriptive.
That they are that they're merely descriptive of reality and not prescriptive. Who can you cite? What notable philosopher or logician can you cite for that definition? Because I think you just made it up.
What relevance would that have?
Well, it'd be dishonest for one thing.
But I'm not being. So you're accusing me of being dishonest now, Jason?
Well, I mean, if you're just pulling definitions out of a hat, then yes.
I'm not pulling them out of a hat.
Yeah, I think the
then
question.
Where are you getting it from?
I think the question is what you're basing it off of. It doesn't necessarily have to be philosophers, but where are you getting it from is probably the question that he's asking.
Well, I mean, if you want to just Google it, you will find that various places will say that it is descriptive. So I am quite happy with it being descriptive. I could alter the way I'm wording it. If if no human minds had ever thought them up, would the laws of logic still exist?
Yes.
And how would they exist, Jason?
Through God.
Let me change the questioning then, because you're assuming your God exists in that answer.
Well, that's my first principle, so it's rational to do so.
If no yes, but as I've pointed out, you've not actually proved that being exists at all.
I don't have to. It's my first principle.
Okay.
First principles don't need to be proven in philosophy.
Oh, well, you're wrong, and that's my first principle. There we go. That's that debate over. But seriously, if no conscious minds existed, would the laws of logic still exist?
If no minds existed, then the laws of logic would not exist, because the laws of logic are concepts. They're not actual things.
So they're conceptual. And what are they concepts of?
The mind, which is something naturalism can't account for.
No, what are they concepts of? Not where do they come from. What are they conceptualizing?
Well, it's the rules of reasoning.
And what are they conceptualizing reasoning about?
Well, I mean, it's just the rules of reasoning. The laws of logic. I mean, the reality. I mean, as far as like the physical reality goes, you can look at quantum mechanics and look at the uncertainty principle and all that. I mean, there's no correlation between the laws of logic and the actual physical reality.
So you're saying there's no correlation between logic and reality?
Well, I mean, I would say yes, but what I'm saying though is that the laws of logic are more or less for the rules of thought, not actually rules that.
So I'm a bit confused, because a moment ago you said that there was no link between them, and now you're saying there is. So which is it?
Well, I guess maybe we're looking at them a little bit differently then, because I'm not saying that. What I'm arguing is that the laws of logic are prescriptive in thought, but they're not descriptive.
Do the laws of logic cause the universe to exist?
The laws of logic cannot cause a universe to exist.
So do they describe the universe that does exist?
Well, you could say that it's possible that it could describe the universe as far as the way, about it existing, but that does not mean that the laws of logic are descriptive in thought, though.
But then, if you're saying they don't cause the universe to exist, and you seem to be reluctant to actually admit that they do describe the universe that exists, what third option could they be if they do neither of those things?
Well, I mean, there would be no conception of the laws of logic if there were no minds to conceive of them.
Okay, but would the universe, so if we had a universe completely stripped of conscious minds, would a four-sided object still have four sides?
It would, but it wouldn't be recognized as a law of logic or a way of thinking, because there would be no mind to conceive of it.
But physical objects would still maintain the exact same form that they have at the moment.
Yes, they would, but we wouldn't be able to conceive of that because there would be no mind to conceive of that fact.
Okay, so the universe would continue quite happily without these laws of logic, in your words, prescribing how it should act.
Well, I mean, I don't hold the position that there is a universe that exists without God, but I would say though that the laws of the logic though there'd be no one to conceive of. The laws of logic are a concept. You could try and use the laws of logic to describe reality, but it doesn't change the fact that the laws of logic are conceptual and conceptual and do not comport with the naturalistic worldview. Because if naturalism is true and all thoughts are just a product of chemical reactions, there's no basis for saying that a chemical reaction is rational or irrational.
Okay, so again, we're coming back to your first point. Your entire worldview rests on the existence of this being that you are reluctant or refusing to even prove exists.
May I ask you a question? Because I've been kind of letting you drive this conversation the whole time.
Let me finish my point. Why should I take your worldview remotely seriously if you're not even willing to?
Okay, I'm just making sure. So, I mean, do you have a first principle now?
No, I've said that I don't. Oh, it's actually saying we'll be right back on there, so hopefully it should come back when Lasoyo rejoins us as he has.
Yeah, sorry
So-
about that, guys. Never have I had the issues with Google until tonight, so I think that I was cursed specific for this. I apologize.
So
It's
we
okay.
should-
I had someone just tell me that the broadcast died, so I don't. So maybe Alex is right. We're not live anymore.
No, I'm just waiting for it to come back. It should come back now in a moment. I'm just waiting to see if it does.
Yeah,
Alright.
it
It's
will.
usually a few moments behind on.
We'll just wait for it and see.
There it
There we
is.
go. We're back.
It's back.
Yeah, we're back up.
Okay, great.
So
All right. So I guess my question is, Alex. I mean, at the very beginning, I asked you what your first principle is, and you're telling me that, and if you don't mind, because I've been letting you ask all the questions for 45 minutes, I'd like to kind of, Lasoyo, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask the questions for the last 15 minutes at least. That's all I'm going to need, if that's okay.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's a conversation. I agree. He's asked a lot of questions.
Yeah,
so
I let him pretty
take
much ask me whatever he wants for 45 minutes. I only need 15 minutes for him, so
Okay.
if
All
that,
right.
I guess.
It's a conversation, guys. We can go longer than that
go
if you
ahead.
need to.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
so
I'm perfectly happy to go longer.
It's up to you
okay,
guys.
so well, I think I'm good with an hour, but
Okay, go ahead.
because I've been sick today. I don't feel particularly good, so. But anyways, Alex, so I'm guessing what I'm asking is I asked you at the very beginning of this conversation if you have a first principle, and you told me that you don't have a first principle. Do you still hold that?
Whether I do or not, it may not even be something I'm conscious of, and it doesn't actually have any bearing on whether whether the atheist part of my worldview is rational or not.
Well, the atheist part of your worldview does inform origins, your conception of morality, your conception of metaphysics. So I would say that atheism can be, in the context of worldview, be mentioned as a worldview since we're talking about the context of theology anyway. But that being said, so if you don't have a first principle, how can you actually test your own epistemology if you don't even know where you're starting from? Because you've been telling me that you knew how you could explain naturally how your epistemology could start at the very beginning. But if you're saying you have no first principle, I don't even see how you can get off the ground unless you're just deciding not to tell me what it is.
I've explained to you that I work through my direct access to the reality I find myself in. That is how I then go on to find knowledge. I've explained to you how I know things about things. That is enough for me. That satisfies me within my worldview.
Well, I mean, if we can just justify things by being subjectively satisfied, then wouldn't that not reduce your worldview to skepticism anyway?
But it also works pragmatically.
Well, as I said before, and it's commonly recognized in philosophy, that pragmatism does not determine what's useful or what's not. There's been a lot of theories in the past that were pragmatic, such as the theory of ether being filling the universe, that turned out to be false. So pragmatism does not actually determine what's true and what's not true.
But you're making a worldview statement about yourself where, as I've said several times, you're refusing to even provide evidence for your foundation. So, again, why should I take your worldview seriously? My
Well,
worldview
I mean,
works
everyone
for my
has a first
satisfaction.
principle, and I hold that anyone who says they don't have a first principle is not being completely honest when they say it.
Jason, you've also, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but you felt like you've been defensive for 45 minutes, so if you want to be proactive in questions, don't get redirected in that too. Just putting that out there because it was brought up. Sorry, go.
Okay, it's fine.
Alex.
So I can't remember what my train of thought was there. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm trying to probe you and see what your first principle is, because if you don't start with anything, I really do not see how you could even get your epistemology off the ground. I made this point at the beginning, but it seems to me that you're putting empiricism first. You're actually using empiricism to verify things, but you're saying that it's not your first principle. I just don't see how you can actually begin to explain your epistemology unless you know where you actually start from.
I am saying, as I've said before, that I may have a first principle that I'm not aware of. Again, the way I'm trying to approach this, Jason, is the way that the person in the street would approach it, not somebody who sits all day thinking about these things, the way that somebody who just goes about their normal day-to-day life. I have practical reasons to believe that my experiences are broadly correct. I have mutually corroborating senses that give me different information, and by your own account, I am not being viciously circular or circular in any way by then using my thought processes to integrate them into concepts. So within the worldview I hold of basing my day-to-day life on what I can directly experience, then I am satisfied within that worldview that I can go about my life. So it comes back to where we started. What practicality do you have that is denied in my worldview, or actually are you just wholesale stealing my worldview and then adding your God belief on top?
I think you're redirecting the conversation again. I've let you do this for the last 45 minutes, but I just can't do it anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and return you. I'm going to go ahead and return you back to the subject matter, and I want to ask you a couple.
So just want to clarify. Then you're not going to answer that question.
I've already answered it earlier in the debate. It'd be wasting time to answer it again. Now let me go ahead and redirect you back to the questions. I've been letting you ask me questions for 45 minutes, and I like to get mine in. Okay.
So be ready.
You said that you hold that philosophy is useless.
I've not said that, but I think most people in the street don't give it a second thought.
Well, that does not actually determine whether or not it has any merit.
It may have merit, but I think that also it can be seen as mental chewing gum. You have to look at its real-world applications.
Well, I mean, but what philosophical inference are you making that says that that something's pragmatic, you're justified in believing it? I can think of a lot of false pragmatic things.
If the modeling of reality that I make by integrating the concept of the objects and surroundings I experience are correct, and I can then negotiate the reality I experience successfully, then that is satisfactory to me. Why is that a problem?
Well, I mean, so if something's satisfactory for you personally, then you're justified in accepting it?
And you're not?
I mean, but just answer the question. You're redirecting it. Can you just answer the question, please?
Why wouldn't I be justified in accepting that as being enough for myself? Because that's a purely subjective view.
So if I accept the axiom of revelation, then you don't really have any grounds to dispute it because it satisfies me.
Now, Jason, do you understand what an axiom is? It's something that exists without having to have further justification. You can't call your revelation an axiom. By definition, it isn't one.
Well, philosophies are weighed by how well they resolve problems, and I hold that the axiom of revelation does solve all the philosophical problems, whereas the philosophy you're putting forth, which is empiricism, does not, because it can't account for the prescriptive concepts of the laws of logic, or morality, or purpose, or anything like that, which you actually live as if these things exist every day, but you seem to deny their significance, which I think is very telling.
But if that's what your subjective opinion is, then that's fine. It doesn't bother me, and it doesn't impact on my ability to live day to day.
So then, basically, what I said in the very first place, your worldview does reduce the skepticism, then, because everything's just.
I've not said that, and you're continually trying to put words into my mouth. And
well, you keep saying that it satisfies you subjectively, and I don't. And if you really agree that we all should accept this one reality, I don't see how that's consistent. You seem to be abandoning your own worldview in order to argue with me, and I don't think that's good for the rationality of atheism.
The rationality of atheism. Are you now talking about the rationality of atheism?
Yes.
Okay, the atheism is the lack of belief in a god or gods. You have yet to even supply any evidence that your god exists. So why should I take your position seriously and change my view from atheism? Because
the presuppositions of atheism are not rational.
It's not my job. The presuppositions of atheism. Now, atheism is a single position on a single topic. So what presuppositions exist about that? I am waiting for you to give me evidence. Provide me with evidence,
There's
Jason.
a fallacy you're committing in what you're doing.
Let me finish. Provide me with evidence and I will worship your God. But so far, in the last 54 minutes, you've refused to do so. Are you able to provide any evidence for your God, or are you just wasting my time?
Jason, if you want to answer that, you can, but don't forget you can redirect back to asking your question.
Yeah, well, I want to redirect because we're not here to argue about the evidence of God. So
I can't let that slide, Jason. How can you argue that your worldview is rational if you are not willing to prove the foundation point for it?
Alex, I think we agreed on a format, and I think you need to stick with it.
Oh, so you can't answer the question. So why should I take you seriously?
That's an argument for silence. That's a fallacy.
Why should this debate continue if you cannot provide evidence of the cornerstone of your argument? How does your argument even stand if you cannot provide evidence that the being that it stands upon exists?
Well, what I'm arguing, Alex, is, and let me just flesh out my approach for you a little bit more so you can understand it. Philosophies are weighed by how well they resolve certain problems, and I'm convinced whenever we confronted the problem of skepticism today, regarding your sense perception and your reasoning, I don't think that you've been able to resolve those problems, whereas Christianity can. You should accept Christianity because Christianity is internally consistent, whereas atheism is not. Now I think you're also committing a fallacy, because what you're doing is that you're trying to conflate the definition of atheism with its implications. When you look at the Oxford Dictionary, it says that atheism is a lack or disbelief in God. That amounts to denial of belief in God. And any philosopher will tell you that your belief in God will determine your other presuppositions about what reality is, about morality, about purpose, and about your epistemology. So you can't just say that atheism is a lack of belief in God and therefore nothing else follows from that. That's simply not true. Also, I want to redirect to, since Celia has given me dominion over the conversation now, I want to ask you a question. Do you hold that you live consistently with your own worldview?
I live absolutely consistently within the worldview I hold, yes.
Okay. If I were to show you how your worldview is how you're not living consistently with your own worldview, would you go ahead and convert to Christianity today?
Considering you firstly can't convince, you've not been actually able to, in fact, you've been unwilling to provide evidence that your God exists.
Well, that's
firstly,
not the question.
Well, I'm answering your question.
I don't think so.
Jason, if you're going to be like this, we'll just finish this now.
Well, are you going to answer the question? Go ahead.
I'm trying to answer the question, but if you continue and interrupt me and tell me that I'm not answering it, then there's no point in me saying anything, is there?
Yeah, and he let him answer it in the way that he chooses to answer it.
Okay.
So restate the question just so I can regain my train of thought.
If I could show you that your worldview is not internally consistent and that you're not living consistently with the implications of your own worldview, will you convert to Christianity today?
No, because you fail to provide any evidence that Christianity is consistent, because you won't even prove that the first foundation of it is in existence.
Okay, so as far as the so then would you go ahead and conclude? Well, let me just rephrase it then. If I show you that you're not living consistently with atheism, will you renounce your atheism?
If you can show me that, well, you would have to then supply me with something that was of equal standing to be able to replace it with. But considering atheism is a single thought on a single topic, I don't see how it actually has any impact on my worldview.
Okay, so I think I've already addressed that mistake. If you want to keep making it, you certainly can.
No, Jason, you see, Jason, let me clarify on this. Christians are Christians in every area of their life. They allow it to infect every single pore of their existence. With people who don't hold those beliefs, the question of religion is a very, very minor part of life and doesn't instruct us in the way we should live everything else. Now, this is something I think Christians make a mistake about. You seem to assume that just because you live that way, everybody else does. And people who don't believe don't have that non-belief in a God as a major thing that influences everything they say or do, unlike Christians, where Christianity does influence everything you say or do. So the question you're asking really is quite malformed, because you're assuming something that isn't the case.
Okay, so let me just get to my point then, and then I'll let you eat it.
Let me eat it.
So is there purpose in life?
In what respect is there a purpose in life? You need to expand on that.
Is there any meaning to life? Does life actually have any intrinsic value? Is there any meaning to it if we're just a universe that's molecules in motion?
That's very reductionist, because we aren't just molecules in motion, are we?
Well, I mean...
to answer the question, is there a meaning in life?
It depends on what Jason means by meaning. We can create meaning in life. I have meaning to my life. The meaning in my life is to try and be as the best person I can be, to minimize harm to others, to maximize the good to others. I work in a job that does things that are good to help other people. I try to make sure that other people are not harmed by my actions. And I try to create things so that when I'm gone, I've left a body of work that people can look back on and know a little bit about me. That is the purpose I have chosen for my life. On a purely biological level, the purpose is to reproduce and to continue the species. That is the basic purpose there. Now, do you disagree with that?
Well, I mean, I guess the problem I have is that once again you're appealing to a subjective purpose. And I mean, if purpose can only be subjective and there's really no ultimate meaning and it all ends the same way anyway, then there's really no grounds for having any purpose in life where God does not exist.
So are you basically saying that if you didn't have a God belief, you would be reduced to just living a completely hedonistic, non-caring lifestyle where you would do whatever you liked and wouldn't care whether it hurt other people?
Well, you see, this is some problem I'm having with
Yes or no?
because whenever I try and make a point, Alex redirects it by asking another question. I really don't think he should be doing it.
It's called a conversation, Jason, and you've dodged a lot of questions.
I think I think I've answered all your questions. I think you've been dodging them, such as you haven't even been telling me where you start in your worldview, and I don't think that's a good thing at all.
Well, I'm sorry you feel that way, but considering you've not been able to provide even the first part of evidence for your worldview, I don't see why I should take you seriously.
Well, I've given good reasons for why my worldview should be accepted and why yours is not consistent.
You haven't even provided evidence for the foundation of your worldview, so why should I take it seriously?
Because my worldview is rational and yours isn't.
So what? I could say that the argument for beer to exist, beer gnomes must exist. Beer exists, therefore beer gnomes exist. That's internally consistent. It doesn't actually.
What would that explain?
It doesn't mean that beer gnomes exist. So you could build an argument that's internally consistent, but it doesn't actually have any practical value in the real world. Now, I've asked you several times, what practical value does your worldview have that mine lacks? You've not answered.
Well, I've answered your question for 45 minutes. I want to be able to ask mine because I haven't been I've been letting you do this for 45 minutes. So let me just go ahead. It's my turn to ask the questions now, I guess. Do you think that internal inconsistency is bad for a worldview?
Do I think that internal inconsistency is bad for a worldview?
Yes.
In what respect am I being internally inconsistent?
Well, just answer the question. You're redirecting it back, and I don't think you should be doing it.
I'm asking you to clarify whether you think I should be doing it or not. You're being vague with your questioning. I want you to clarify.
I think I'm being rather specific. Do you think that it is irrational to hold to a worldview that is not internally consistent in both its first principle and its presuppositions?
Do I think that that is irrational? I have never given it any thought, Jason, because it doesn't have any real-world practicality.
Based on your opinion right now, what would you say? Are you uncomfortable without thinking about it a little more?
Based on my opinion, I don't have an opinion on it.
Okay, so the answer is no. No.
Okay. I think as far as the conversation goes, I like to say some closing things, but before I do, does Alex have anything he wants to say before we end it?
Yeah, I don't know why you think that not being able to even provide evidence for your initial claim is a good argument.
Is that all you want to say to close it?
Yeah, because why should I even consider my worldview irrational if you can't even present evidence to support yours?
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just say my final thoughts on it. My first thought is that Alex has not provided a first principle, so because he doesn't have anywhere he starts with, his worldview cannot get off the ground in the first place. The second thing is I have pressed him on the prescriptive laws of logic he claims are descriptive, which would mean that there's no duty to follow them, and I think that's irrational. And because of that, I don't think his worldview can account for rationality in the first place. And my other conclusion as well is that Alex is having to leave the subjective implications of his worldview in order to appeal to some sort of objective reality. Whenever he admits that his conception of reality is subjective in nature, and based off of that, I don't think he's arguing consistently with his worldview in the first place. And that's really all I have to say.
Well, let me say that, Jason, I don't even know how you can say that your worldview is rational at all if you can't provide any evidence at all for its foundation. And I know I'm repeating it myself, but I think it's important.
Well, you're appealing to an argument for silence, but our debate tonight was about whether or not Christianity or atheism was rational. So it wasn't. If you ever want to have a debate about the evidence of God, we can do that. But that's not what I came here to do tonight.
Jason, the notion of your worldview being rational depends entirely on the existence of that which it is foundationed by, and you have not been able to provide any evidence for that, so I have no reason to take you seriously.
Well, I mean, according to Scripture, even if I gave you the evidence, you wouldn't accept it anyway.
And that's where
But you've not even proved that your God could write a Bible, so let alone prove it exists. So.
I think Osoyo wants to. What are you saying, Osoyo?
I'm just saying at this juncture, it's now 8:04. So, and I know you were kind of on a time schedule. So if we wanted to end it there, we can. I might keep this open if anyone else wants to join, just to have a conversation about what discussed. I know the Bible Thumping Wingnut is also having an after show. Alex, were you going to do something like that, or did you want to stay here? Or?
I'm not sure. I possibly will go and do something myself.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything more to say here. I don't think Jason's made a point. So.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on, Lasalle, and Alex. Thanks for coming on and chatting and everything.
Okay.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Hope y'all have a wonderful night. Alex, if you want me to post it in the link here, I can definitely do that too. Just same time. Or Skype me. Sorry, same time as well.
Okay.
Later,
Cheers.
guys.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.